Bruce Lee explained real combat without throwing a punch. In 60 seconds, he dismantled every myth. He did not stand up. He did not demonstrate. He did not raise his voice. For 60 seconds, Bruce Lee remained exactly where he was. When it was over, no one argued, not because they were persuaded, but because the myths they relied on no longer held together. No punches were thrown. No techniques were shown. Yet what people believed about real combat quietly fell apart, one assumption at a time. Bruce Lee did not claim authority. He let clarity do that for him. The room did not look like a place where myths were formed. It was practical, neutral, familiar to the people inside it. Chairs arranged without ceremony. Walls lined with equipment that suggested experience rather than theory. This was a space where ideas about fighting had been discussed for years, refined through repetition and reinforced by shared belief. Most of the men in the room had trained extensively. Some had competed, others had taught. Their understanding of combat was not theatrical. It was functional, or so they believed. They trusted what had worked before. They trusted methods that produced visible results. Power was something you could see. Skill was something you could measure. Effectiveness revealed itself through dominance. These assumptions were not stated aloud. They did not need to be. They lived in the way the room carried itself, in the confidence of posture, in the language used casually without explanation. Bruce Lee sat among them, not apart. He did not position himself as an authority. He did not arrive with the intent to instruct. His presence did not interrupt the rhythm of the room. Conversation continued around him, steady and assured. They spoke about real fights as though the term were self-evident, about what lasted under pressure, about what failed when rules disappeared. The distinctions were familiar, passed from one generation of fighters to the next. Bruce Lee listened. He did not nod in agreement. He did not signal disagreement. His attention remained steady, unreactive. Where others leaned forward to reinforce a point, he remained still. The myths were not crude. They were sophisticated, shaped by experience and repetition. That was what gave them strength. They had survived long enough to feel unquestionable. When Bruce Lee was mentioned, it was indirectly. A reference to speed, to appearance, to what translated on screen versus what held up outside it. The tone was not dismissive, only certain. Certainty does not require volume. Bruce Lee did not challenge it. He understood that these ideas had not been formed through ignorance. They had been formed through narrow success, through winning within a specific frame, then mistaking that frame for reality itself. The room was not waiting for correction. It was waiting for confirmation. At this stage, nothing demanded disruption. The myths were intact, stable, supported by shared confidence. There was no tension yet, only momentum. And Bruce Lee allowed that momentum to continue, because dismantling a myth too early only strengthens it. Clarity, he knew, required timing, and timing had not yet arrived. The question did not arrive with importance. It was offered casually, almost as an aside, posed during a lull in the conversation when the room had already agreed with itself. It was not framed as a challenge, nor was it directed with intention. It sounded practical, reasonable, familiar. Someone asked Bruce Lee what he believed real combat actually was, when rules were gone, when conditions were unpredictable, when intention mattered more than form. The expectation was subtle but shared. He would either answer technically, naming methods, distances, strategies, or he would defer, acknowledging complexity, suggesting that demonstration mattered more than words. Both outcomes fit the room's understanding. Bruce Lee did neither. He did not shift in his seat. He did not prepare to teach. He did not ask for clarification. He considered the question briefly, not because it was difficult, but because it was incomplete. The room waited. This was not a hostile pause. It was anticipatory, the kind that assumes the answer will confirm what everyone already believes, perhaps with a new phrasing, perhaps with refinement. Bruce Lee looked at the person who had asked, then slowly at the others. Not to measure reaction, but to understand context. He was not deciding what to say. He was deciding what not to say. He recognized that the question was rooted in assumption, that it treated combat as an exchange of techniques rather than a condition shaped by awareness, timing, and consequence. To answer it directly would have meant accepting its limits. So he reframed it without announcing that he was doing so. When Bruce Lee finally spoke, his voice was calm, measured, almost conversational. He did not elevate the moment. He did not lower it either. He began by describing what combat was not in theory, not in ideal conditions, not in training. There was no philosophy offered yet, no principles laid out, just observation, plain, unembellished, grounded in experience rather than explanation. The room listened closely now, not because he was persuasive, but because he was precise. His words did not contradict what others believed. They quietly removed the foundation those beliefs stood on. He spoke about uncertainty without drama, about chaos without fear, about consequence without emphasis. He did not argue against myths. He spoke as if they were irrelevant, and in doing so, he changed the nature of the question itself. What had been asked as a request for definition became something else entirely, a recognition that the room had been discussing combat as an idea, not as a reality. Bruce Lee did not pause for reaction. He continued calmly, aware that the most effective dismantling does not feel like opposition. It feels like clarification. And as the room adjusted to that shift, it became clear that the answer would not require movement, only attention. Bruce Lee did not stand. That alone unsettled a few expectations. In rooms like this, authority often rose to its feet. Demonstration followed explanation. Movement confirmed credibility. But Bruce Lee remained seated, his posture unchanged, his hands still. He spoke evenly, without emphasis, not to instruct, but to describe. He talked about distance first, not as a tactic, but as a condition. How most confrontations ended before they truly began. How positioning decided outcomes long before strength or speed were tested. There was no mention of techniques, no references to styles, no hierarchy of methods. Instead, he described moments, brief, unremarkable moments that most people overlooked. The instant before engagement, the pause, where intent was revealed, the misjudgment that created consequence. The room grew quiet. What he was saying did not contradict anyone directly. It simply bypassed the logic that had framed earlier discussions. Combat, as he described it, was not an exchange to be won. It was a situation to be navigated. He spoke about simplicity, not as an ideal, but as a necessity. How complexity collapsed under pressure, how excess movement created openings, how efficiency was not elegance, but survival. Still, he did not raise his voice. He did not attempt to convince. The effect came from how little he said. Each sentence removed another layer of assumption. That strength guaranteed outcome. That toughness ensured dominance. That preparation alone equaled readiness. Bruce Lee did not dismiss training. He placed it in context. Training, he explained, was meant to reduce hesitation, not to replace awareness. Technique existed to serve the moment, not to dominate it. When conditions changed, attachment became liability. No one interrupted him, not because they were in agreement, but because interruption would have required certainty, and certainty was quietly dissolving. The 60 seconds passed almost unnoticed. There was no crescendo, no concluding statement. He did not signal that he was finished. He simply stopped speaking. The room remained still, not waiting for more, but processing what had already been said. The myths had not been attacked. They had been left behind. Bruce Lee had not proven anything. He had removed the need for proof, and in that absence, the room began to understand that real combat was not something to be demonstrated on command. It was something you recognized, or you didn't. The silence that followed was not empty. It was recalibrating. Bruce Lee did not revisit his earlier points. He did not summarize. He did not reinforce. Instead, he continued as though the room had already shifted, because it had. He spoke briefly about force, not as something to generate, but as something to manage. How power, when pursued directly, often arrived too late. How the insistence on strength created predictability, and predictability created vulnerability. There was no criticism in his tone, only observation. He described how real encounters rarely allowed time for commitment, how decisions were made in fractions of moments, often before the body was fully aware of them. In such conditions, effort became a liability. The more one tried to impose, the less one perceived. These were not principles delivered as doctrine. They were statements of fact. He spoke of adaptability without naming it, of restraint without praising it, of awareness without elevating it into philosophy. Each idea stood on its own, unadorned, and therefore difficult to dispute. The myths began to loosen quietly. That toughness alone ensured survival. That aggression dictated control. That winning meant overpowering. Bruce Lee did not say these ideas were wrong. He spoke as if they simply did not apply. That distinction mattered. The room did not feel corrected. It felt repositioned. Someone might have expected a concluding remark, a line to gather the thoughts together, to mark the end of explanation. Bruce Lee offered none. He allowed the 60 seconds to end without punctuation. The effect was immediate but understated. No one asked for clarification. No one requested a demonstration. No one countered with experience. The framework that would have supported those responses no longer held. Bruce Lee leaned back slightly, returning to the posture he had held before the question was asked. The moment closed without ceremony, as if nothing unusual had occurred. Yet the room understood that something essential had been dismantled. Not forcefully, not publicly, but completely. The myths had not been exposed as false. They had been rendered unnecessary, and once unnecessary, they could not be defended. The silence that followed was not hesitation. It was comprehension. The silence did not invite interruption. It settled naturally, as though the room had reached the end of a thought rather than the end of a statement. People shifted slightly in their seats, not in discomfort, but in adjustment. The posture of certainty softened. No one asked Bruce Lee to demonstrate. That absence was significant. In earlier moments, proof had been assumed necessary. Demonstration was the currency through which credibility was usually exchanged. But now the request felt misplaced, not because it would have been refused, but because it would have misunderstood what had just occurred. The explanation had not asked to be verified. It had reorganized the conditions under which verification made sense. Bruce Lee remained present, but no longer central. His role in the conversation had concluded without formal closure. He did not linger on the subject. He did not attempt to reinforce his point with repetition or analogy. Others began to speak again, cautiously. The tone was different. Statements became tentative. Claims were framed as observations rather than conclusions. Language that once sounded assured now carried qualification. The shift was not dramatic, but it was unmistakable. Someone mentioned experience. Another referred to training, but neither spoke with the same finality as before. The myths had not been challenged openly, yet they no longer anchored the discussion. Bruce Lee listened once more. He did not correct what followed. He did not add commentary. The work had already been done. Any further input would have risked turning clarity into persuasion. At some point, the conversation moved on entirely, not away from combat, but away from certainty. The room returned to its ordinary rhythm, but the rhythm itself had changed. Where confidence once filled the space easily, there was now room for reconsideration. Bruce Lee gathered his things quietly. No one stopped him. No one asked for continuation. No one felt the need to resolve what had been left open. As he stood to leave, a few eyes followed him, not with curiosity, but with recognition. Something essential had been understood, even if it could not yet be articulated. The proof had not been withheld, it had become irrelevant. And in that irrelevance, the room began to sense that real combat was not something you proved to others. It was something you understood, or you didn't. The moment was not recorded. There was no note taken, no reference logged for later discussion. When the room eventually emptied, it did so without acknowledging that anything decisive had occurred. On the surface, the meeting ended as meetings often do, quietly without punctuation. But for those who had been present, the explanation did not fade. It resurfaced later, in unexpected places. During training sessions where old assumptions suddenly felt inadequate. In conversations where confidence paused before becoming assertion. In moments when restraint seemed more appropriate than response. No one quoted Bruce Lee's words precisely. They remembered the effect instead. Years later, Some would struggle to explain why that minute had stayed with them. It had not offered a system to adopt or a technique to practice. It had not demanded allegiance. What it had done was remove the comfort of certainty. That absence proved durable. Bruce Lee never referred back to the conversation. He did not frame it as a teaching moment or recount it as evidence of insight. To him, it had been situational, appropriate to that room, those people, that moment. Its endurance came from that restraint. Because it was never reinforced, it was never diluted. Because it was never claimed, it was never resisted. The explanation remained intact precisely because it had not tried to persist. Over time, the myths it quietly dismantled did not vanish. All at once, they loosened gradually, giving way to something less rigid and more attentive. Those who had relied on force began to notice timing. Those who trusted dominance began to recognize awareness, not because they had been instructed to, but because they had been shown, briefly, what no longer held. The legacy of that minute was not agreement. It was recalibration, a reminder that real combat, like real understanding, does not announce itself. It does not demand belief. It reveals itself only when the conditions are right and disappears the moment it has done its work. Bruce Lee left that room as he had entered it, without emphasis, without correction, without insistence. What followed him was not applause or recognition, it was silence. And in that silence, a generation of assumptions slowly learned how to let go.